It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail.
Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines proof as the cogency of evidence that compels acceptance by the mind of the truth or a fact. So in the search for evidence to prove that climate change is real, I spoke to a naturalist, an activist, a biologist, a researcher, a scientist, and a filmmaker who spent time on Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay, which is succumbing to the effects of rising sea levels.
I saw a place that's disappearing very quickly, and I saw a community that's trying to reconcile this loss through their own lens.
But if a disappearing island in the Chesapeake Bay, only 93 miles from the White House, cannot convince our government of the reality of climate change, what will?
We track the Arctic sea ice, cover the ice in the ocean. It's the world's frozen ocean. And we have seen that since we started tracking it with our best modern satellite starting in 1979, we've lost almost half of the ice cover in the Arctic Ocean. That is basically equivalent to about half of the lower 48 United States.
The water is getting so warm that we're having more frequent algal blooms. And they're also happening earlier in the years. And the one that we get the most often is called Pseudonychia. It produces a toxin called domoic acid.
Behind this truck right now are 2 sea lions that were rescued. They were impacted by domoic acid toxicity.
That toxin, when built up in the system, attacks your nervous system to the point of having seizures and even death. So these algal blooms historically have only happened every 3 to 5 years concurrent with El Nino. However, the last 4 years we've had them consecutively. And each year they've gotten bigger and the toxicity has been more intense.
We know that there are changes in the ocean in terms of marine life responding to it, like things like coral bleaching, which is a real problem.
We're seeing an amplification of the warming and higher and faster warming in the Arctic than we're seeing globally. That obviously has effects on the ecosystem, on the animals and plants living in the Arctic, such as polar bears and seals.
So a really good example is the gray whale. It's the first species that was taken off the endangered species list after whaling. And it had gotten up to about 27,000 whales. And then in 2019, from 2019 to 2023, we had an unusual mortality event, meaning that these whales were washing ashore emaciated. What's happening is the algae that's being eaten up by the fish before it gets down to the amphipods. So in essence, the amphipods starve, and when the gray whales come up to the Arctic to feed, they're not finding as much food.
For example, in the Arctic Ocean, a couple degrees from 31 degrees Fahrenheit to 33 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the difference between ice skating and swimming.
But it's not just the Arctic that's affected.
There are also implications globally. Because the Arctic served as the globe's air conditioner. So, as we warm the planet in general, there's more energy, and that leads to more extremes, more extreme heat waves. There's more energy for stronger storms.
We're seeing some of the worst heat waves in human history, and they progressively get worse every year.
That's really disturbing.
And it doesn't matter where you live. Hurricane Helene here in North Carolina hit the mountain region. From a hurricane, you would think we're a coastal state, but yet it was actually our mountain area that was so deeply affected. We were also losing enormous amount of trees from these storms. So the very thing that helps protect us from the storms are also getting lost in this equation.
We've seen this when it comes to Texas having ice storms and snowstorms, and their state is not equipped to deal with it.
The changing climate also affects migration patterns, sometimes with catastrophic consequences as species arrive in places where they cannot sustain themselves.
We watch different species of birds over the last 50 years. Certain species have shifted populations north We've noticed things like a few bird species, brown pelicans we never had 30 years ago. Now we're seeing more of them. They're coming up the coast. We're expecting things like this white ibis, which I always used to see in Florida, and then I started seeing them in Virginia, and now they're in South Jersey. So we're expecting in the next few years that we'll have white ibis in New York City.
Birds are confused as to where to fly, and they migrate to the wrong places, or in places that they wouldn't typically.
And while it's natural for animals to adapt to changing environments, this change is coming on too quickly.
When you look at geologic history, you can clearly see that the time frame in which our climate change has progressed is significantly faster than would happen naturally in the geographic record. And that's the real problem, because it does not give species the opportunity to adjust.
We actually can look at chemical signatures in the atmosphere from carbon dioxide and recognize that that increase is largely due to fossil fuel emissions and is not natural.
It's not something that is make-believe or pretend. It's not something that you can ignore.
But is this enough evidence to compel acceptance?
It's hard to convince people that don't want to believe it.
I'm here to tell the truth. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me.
That there's this political rift around the issues around climate.
So, it's hard to convince people that aren't willing to basically face the facts.
If people are going to continue to resist that, then we're not going to have forward movement with regard to solutions.
We could have been addressing this issue since the 90s.
The carbon footprint is a hoax made up by people with evil intentions, and they're heading down a path of total destruction.
I say, look at the data. Who are you believing? What studies are you showing that says it isn't?
The whole thing is crazy.
There was that great debate in this country about what's real and what's not real and what's fake and everything else. But the great body of science is telling us what's real. What else do we have to go by? Am I going to believe 98% of scientists, or are I going to believe 2% of scientists that denying it?
Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything.